Heir to the Sundered Crown. The Sundered Crown Saga Book 1. Written by M.S. Olney. Narrated by Joseph Tweedale. Prologue. Lightning lit up the sky, and thunder battered the senses of the watchmen. All night they guarded the palace's great gate, while the storm raged all around them. For hours the elements had illuminated the sky in a cacophony of light. For most of their shift, the guardsmen had huddled in the limited shelter of a small guardhouse. "Here, Jonas, who would be out there on a night like this?" the guard captain muttered to his fellow watchman. A stooped figure was shuffling along the road, the heavy rain obscuring the vision of the guards. Jonas was a boy of no more than 17 who had just joined the guards division and was in training to join the King's Legion proper. He leaned out of the side of the guard station to take a look at the figure. "They must be ruddy mad to be out in weather like this. The poor bugger must be soaked right through." Jonas took a step out into the road and moved towards the shuffling person. As he approached, he could hear a strange sniffing sound. It sounded as if the figure was crying. It was a woman, Jonas realized. "Here, Cody," he called to his colleague. "Come here, I think this woman's hurt." "Captain Cody to you, son," the grizzled elder man growled irritably as he stepped in front of the hunched woman. He gestured impatiently for his inferior to halt the woman. She seemed determined to shuffle straight past them and through the gate. "Here, love, are you okay? You'll catch your death if you stay out in this weather much longer," Jonas said, ignoring the pompous captain. Jonas reached for the woman's arm. Instantly the stooped figure stopped, before rising from her hunched position to a straight-backed one. With an eerie silence, Captain Cody watched in terror as the woman grabbed Jonas's chainmail-covered arm and wrenched the terrified lad to the ground. Instantly she was on him, a dagger in hand, slashing and hacking the boy's head and neck. Seconds later, the now blood-soaked woman stood and held the guard's severed head in her hand. Her robe had slid off, revealing a taut, naked body, with the rain washing across her flesh, cleansing the young guard's blood into the road. She turned her head and stared at Cody, a manic look in her eyes. Cody stood and watched, paralyzed in fear as she advanced on him. He staggered backwards, desperately trying to unsheath his sword. With startling speed, the woman came at him. With one savage swipe of her dagger, Captain Cody joined his comrade in the underworld. The woman turned to look out over the city. The city of Sunguard's light looked like a vast sea of fireflies in the night, the effect only slightly dampened by the heavy rain. Occasionally, bright forks of lightning would flash on the distant horizon, making the night as bright as day. The plateau was impregnable to any army willing to directly assault it. The long winding road that led to the plateau's peak, to the palace in the centre, was defended by a number of guard towers and defensive kill zones. The steep sides and formidable man-made defences ensured the king's palace would be able to fend off any enemies. Any enemies, save one. She walked to the guardhouse, taking a flaming torch off the wall and, with a smile, walked to the edge of the winding road and waved the torch 3 times. It was the signal for the Crimson Blades. Elena cradled the girdling baby in her arms. The little prince was restless. The storm had kept him awake all night so far. Or was it something else? Elena had felt uneasy this night, and yet she had no reason to be. It was a night like any other, aside from the vicious storm battering the palace. The gods were angry this night. She shook her head and chided herself. "There's nothing to fear, my little prince," she said soothingly, in part to calm the baby and partly to make herself feel better. "It's just the weather keeping you up, nothing more." The nursery was a large, bright room, lit by candles and painted in soothing pastel colours. Pictures of dogs, cats, and a friendly-looking black bear adorned the walls. It was a peaceful place. Elena had been the nanny to the baby prince since he was born, 6 months ago, and was chosen from a number of prestigious candidates. She had felt great pleasure beating the rival girls to the job, and was immensely proud of her position. Above all, she had learnt to love the baby as though he was her own. She would do anything for him, even give her life if needed. Little did she know that tonight she would have to put her commitment to the test. Elena eventually got the baby off to sleep, returning to her own bed, which was next door to the nursery. The wind was howling outside, and the rumble of thunder added to the sense of unease she felt. She took her ivory brush and began dragging it through her hair, a habit from her childhood. It was something she did to ease her worries, but the nagging feeling remained, like an itch she could not scratch. She stood up after several minutes to pace the room. "This is silly," she muttered to herself. The sound of running feet stopped her pacing. The footsteps were drawing closer to the nursery. Who would be running around the palace at this time of night, she wondered. She ran to her bed and felt under the pillow. The hilt of the silver dagger her father had given her gave her comfort as she picked it up. She drew the blade and moved quickly to the nursery. The running footsteps were outside the door. The nursery door was kicked in with a loud crash, waking the baby prince. In the doorway stood Commander Davik, the head of the King's Guard. In his gold and black plate armour, he looked like a hero from the old stories. "Elena, thank Neverin you're safe," he breathed in relief. "What has happened, my lord? Why are you dressed for battle?" she questioned, clutching the dagger tightly to her chest. "There's not much time, Elena," he replied hastily, grabbing a travel bag off the nursery wall. "We have to get you and the prince to safety. The palace is under attack." The king and queen were the first to die. After their guards had all been silently dispatched, the assassins entered the royal bedchamber. There, their victims lay soundly asleep. 2 quick cuts with the assassins' blades, and the heads of the kingdom were dead. In other rooms around the palace and in locations all over the kingdom, similar murders were taking place. The dire sect had failed to warn the king, and because of that failure, the royal family of Delfinnia was eliminated. The princes, Drayson and Heir, were brutally murdered as they tried to flee their beds, and their sisters, the 2 young princesses, were strangled in their sleep. Chapter 1. 3 years later. Word had spread like wildfire through Calderia, the last majestic city of the mages in Delfinnia. Excited crowds ran through the streets cheering. Peddlers made sure to put out their most precious stock, and the city's crystalline buildings were decorated in a plethora of dazzlingly colourful banners. Street magicians competed to the joy of the watching audiences. Puffs of purple smoke and flashes of flame and lightning amazed and stupefied the crowds. The news of the Baron of Balnor's rout at the Golden Hills had been warmly welcomed by the citizens of the West. A people whose loyalty remained strong to the Privy Council of nobles that had assumed power upon the murder of the royal family. The War of the 6 Claimants was deep into its 3rd bloody year, and any victory was celebrated. Trying to make his way through the bustling throng was a young lad named Luxon. He pushed and squeezed, dodged and dived until he could get clear and take a few hurried steps further towards his destination. He glanced up at the huge clock tower dominating the city plaza and cursed as he realized that time had once again betrayed him. It was a few minutes shy of 10 bells. No way would he make it this time. He flicked his sandy hair from his eyes, frantically looking for a passageway through the sea of people. He narrowed his eyes, holding an arm up to shield them from the bright, warm sun. Across the plaza, he could see his rival, Acadus, smiling cruelly and shaking his head tauntingly. Luxon swore loudly, thumping his hand against the stone ledge he was standing against. The sot was going to beat him again and no doubt would land him in more hot water with Master Brygus. No, he wouldn't get another thrashing from the old mage, not today. He thought desperately. Wagons, horses, cattle, and of course the mass of humanity all barred his way through the plaza and to his destination at the school. He racked his mind for anything useful and laughed out loud at his foolishness. "Of course!" he exclaimed loudly, causing some in the great crowd to turn and look inquisitively in his direction. Deftly, Luxon climbed up on the stony ledge just above him and hauled himself upwards, a move that caused more people in the thronging crowd to pay him some attention. He sat down and removed his velvet shoes and cotton socks, the warm air feeling good against his bare toes. The 14-year-old clapped his sweating palms together, licked his lips, and waggled his toes. "Okay, here goes," he mumbled to no one in particular. He took a deep breath, remembering what he had read in the 5th volume of The Wizard's Craft, a text he had managed to smuggle out of the Great Library only 2 days previously. Closing his eyes, he focused his mind. A tickling sensation passed through his body, sliding rapidly to his feet. He picked up his discarded shoes and tucked them into one of the pockets of his blue coat. A swirling of air focused itself underneath his bare soles, and then, tentatively, he stepped off the ledge. The surprised gasps of the surrounding onlookers and the fact that he had not fallen caused him to open his eyes. He almost laughed with delight. He had done it. He had actually managed to successfully cast a levitation spell. When he felt himself on the verge of falling, he flapped his arms like some newly fledged bird. He narrowed his eyes and deepened his concentration. Through half-lidded eyes, he sought out the opposite end of the plaza, and slowly but surely made his way towards it. The crowd by now had stopped what they were doing to gawp at the lanky boy floating above their heads. Men and women stood slack-jawed at the sight, whilst children laughed and pointed. A caravaneer almost crashed his mule and cart as he failed to notice a wall. After a few moments, Luxon felt sweat trickle down his brow, and his limbs began to feel rubbery. He picked up the pace, making it across the crowd to the archway leading to the school. Tiredness crept into every inch of his body, threatening to overwhelm him. Finally it became too much, and the swirling wind under his feet began to peter out of existence. Not good, Luxon thought. Desperately looking around for another ledge to cling to or a soft place to fall, he grit his teeth, focusing even harder than before, putting every ounce of power within him into the levitation spell. He made 3 more steps before a wave of blackness blurred his vision. The archway to the school was right below him. He fell as his vision faded. Someone in the crowd screamed. Luxon groggily opened his eyes to find himself in a large 4-poster bed. 4 thick, feather-filled pillows supported his head, and the quilt he was tucked into was thick with sheep's wool. A single candle lit the room, casting shadows upon several paintings that adorned the walls. He recognized one as a portrait of Zarnia the Great, the wizard's long white hair and thick beard billowing in the mighty wind. In his left hand was the staff, Erdasol, and in his right was the legendary sword, Asphodel. The long blade was emblazoned with light, and the staff lived up to its name, Earth's Fire. Luxon slowly sat up, instantly regretting his decision to do so, as a wave of nausea threatened to make him vomit.
"You're not Zarnia, just yet,"
a chuckling voice spoke from the darkness.
"Although, saying that, a lad just shy of 15 summers being able to control a spell of the upper ring is certainly impressive."
Luxon slumped back miserably onto the pillows, another wave of dizziness causing the room to spin. Master Rygus?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The elderly tutor rose from his high-backed chair and stepped into the candlelight. His wrinkled face was covered in liver spots. His grey hair was long and straggly, and only the small pair of spectacles perched upon a hook nose hinted that he was an intellectual, and not some scruffy beggar from off the street. He had taught Luxon and the other boys and girls for over 2 years in the school of the lower ring, and rightly had a reputation for his tough style of educating. On more than one occasion, Luxon had received whacks with the rod, either because of his wild curiosity, or because Eclin had baited him. Rygus sat at the end of the bed, smiling, an expression that took Luxon by surprise. He'd been expecting his teacher to raise fury at his latest stunt, not sit at the bedside with a smile. "What happened?" he asked, as he once more tried to sit up. The dizziness came again, but it was not as bad as before. Rygus removed his spectacles and wiped them on his long grey robe.
"You fell," he replied simply. "Luckily, I saw the whole thing and was able to catch you with a telekinetic spell before you cracked your head open like a grapefruit. The reason you feel so nauseous is no doubt due to your overexerting your mind to keep the levitation spell intact. A spell, mind you, that one as young as you should never have attempted."
The old master stood and stretched his back.
"One as young as you, in theory, should not even have been able to have gotten the spell to work at all, which is troubling."
"I'm sorry, master," Luxon said miserably. "I just didn't want to be late for classes again.
Eclin in my shoes again, and..."
Rygus held up a hand in annoyance.
"I do not care for the follies of young men. Making a foe of Eclin was not a wise move on your part."
He glared at his young student as the lad tried to talk.
"Listen to me, Luxon. You are one of the most promising students I have ever seen pass through the crystal gates, and I will not have you ruin your chances of making apprentice because of some foolish feud."
Luxon looked at his hands. He hadn't had any idea that the old man thought that way about his abilities. He knew he was good, but his thirst for knowledge often saw him getting into scrapes with the city guards and the other teachers. The old man's expression softened.
"Eclin will always loathe you, Luxon. His father is Baron of Redbit, as you well know, and what your father did..."
He trailed off, as he saw tears beginning to form in his pupil's eyes. "My father was loyal to the king," Luxon spoke miserably. "The Baron had no right to make a claim. My father swore he spoke the truth that day, and lost his head for it." Luxon's father had been a noble in the court of the capital at Sungard. With the royal line lost, the realm's leaders had gathered to discuss the succession. Garrick, Luxon's father, had testified to the gathering that the king's youngest child had escaped the assassins, swearing blind that he had helped a young woman smuggle the baby boy out of the city. Acadus's father had condemned Garrick as a liar of the worst degree, arguing that the palace had been burnt to ashes by the assassins, and that all of the bodies had been accounted for. After the summit, Garrick had hurried back to his home and told his wife and son to pack for travel at once. Luxon had been afraid as any boy of just 11 years would be. That same night, the Baron's men came to their home and, without preamble, dragged the stricken Garrick into the streets. In the confusion, Luxon and his mother managed to escape the city. It had been a month later that they had heard his father's fate. Anger surged through him, his hands knotting into fists at the memory. "Acadus hates me because I know his father is a lying sack of—" A knock on the small room's door interrupted him. "Come in," Regis said, placing a calming hand on Luxon's shoulder. The lad choked back tears as another wave of nausea struck. The door opened, and into the room walked a man dressed in black leather armour. He was no older than 30, but his long black hair had traces of silver along the sides. His face was hard, and a scar ran from the top of his right eye down towards his bearded jaw. Luxon's eyes widened as he realized the man was a Nightblade, an order of highly skilled agents. Since the beginning of the war, the Nightblades had abandoned their posts across the realm. They were sworn to the king and no other. Until a rightful successor won the throne, they had vowed to play no part in the fighting. Instead, they had returned to Calderia, the only city in Delfinnia where they could practice their magic freely.
"Ah, Wellesley. I forgot all about the meeting. Forgive me,"
Master Regis said. The old man shook the Nightblade's hand before turning to look at Luxon.
"I'm afraid Luxon here distracted me from our business," he added, gesturing to his student.
Wellesley nodded to Luxon in greeting. "Ah yes, the boy who caused all of that commotion in the quartz quarter. I hear you put on quite a show," Wellesley chuckled. "If you would excuse your master, the council has need of us and we shall not tarry further. Get well soon, Luxon." "Shall we, Regis?" He held the door open for the aging mage and followed him out of the room. Luxon stared at the now closed door, a feeling of excitement in his gut. He'd actually spoken to a Nightblade. He was sure all of the other students would be jealous of that. Tiredness came to him, and before he knew it, he was once again drifting off into a deep sleep. The dream is always the same. The lone tree standing on the hilltop, its withered branches stretching towards the heavens. The sky is always a tumultuous riot of colour. A name is always whispered on the breeze, growing louder and louder as he walks numbly towards it. The voice is familiar, as though he had heard it once before, long ago. A sense of dread winds its way into his stomach as he approaches the tree, its knotted roots jutting out from its grotesque body, trying to trip him as he walks ever onwards to the top of the hill. Each time he dreams, Luxon always wakes before he reaches the summit. But deep down in his gut he knows that something lies beyond the horizon, something terrifying, something that he does not want to see. The whisper grows louder and louder until it turns into a scream, a woman's scream, a woman in agony and despair, and she always would scream his name. Just as he reaches the tree and crests the hill, the sky turns black and silence descends upon him, and there he sees it. A spectre. It stands there in the shadows, staring, its features hidden by the darkness. The sense that he knows its name frustrates him like in a dream where you can never reach where you want to go. A name that tries to claw its way through to his waking mind, a name that he knows is full of woe. The spectre raises its hand, pointing at him, and then a menacing laugh emanates from the darkness, laughter that promises pain, despair, and evil intent. The laughter becomes deafening, threatening to burst his eardrums, until finally he wakes, covered in sweat, breathing hard, his heart racing with fear. Chapter 2. "You still not sleeping well?" asked Yeppert, the short, fat boy who was Luxon's only real friend in the whole of Calderia. The lad hailed from the small village of Plock, on the eastern shore. His broad eastern accent gave him away of someone who didn't come from wealth or prestige, but no gentler soul could anyone hope to find. "The same dream every night," Luxon replied miserably as he wearily wrapped his cloak about his shoulders. It had been 2 days since the incident in the plaza, and word of his deed had spread rapidly through the city's schools. Luxon's ego and reputation was at a high, but his energy wasn't. The two boys were in their dorm room in the boarding hall. For the past 3 years, the place had been home. But to Luxon, it felt more like a prison. "I overheard Master Kvar say that dreams were important to folk like us," Yeppert said, as he bent to tie his shoes. Even such a simple task as that seemed difficult for him, his rotund shape not making it easy for him to bend. Luxon snorted. "I heard that Master Kvar is nuttier than squirrel poo, and that he tried to transmute his cat into a horse. I'll be fine. It's probably just stress or something. And the whole thing with the Cadus is getting to me." Yeppert finished tying his shoe and wrapped himself in his massive cloak. On the chubby boy, it looked more like a tent than an item of clothing. Luxon couldn't help but smile. His friend may appear to be an eastern simpleton, but he knew better. Behind those nervous eyes was a profound intellect, an intellect that almost matched his own. Almost. The two of them left their room and began making their way through the city. Peddlers and merchants were already out on the cobbled streets, eager to sell their wares. The small stone shops that nestled under the massive green crystalline walls were beginning to open their doors, and scholars and officials made their way to their places of work. It always surprised Luxon just how busy this city became at such an early hour, how normal things were despite there being a vicious war being waged outside its walls. "Uh-oh," Yeppert exclaimed, coming to a halt. Luxon stopped too, looking at his friend in confusion. "What?" he asked. Yeppert's face had gone a deep crimson red. He pointed. There, through the break in the crowd of bustling folk, stood Cadus and his 3 thugs. They regularly persecuted Luxon and Yeppert. With Luxon, they often just snarled insults, but with Yeppert, they got violent. Anger swelled up inside Luxon as he remembered the last time his friend had staggered into the dorm room, bruised and battered. He itched to teach the bully a lesson, but any use of magic for such a thing would instantly see him cast out of the city, and with the strict laws regarding magic users, he would very likely never be able to practice his skills ever again. "Let's take the long way round," Luxon said through gritted teeth. He didn't want any trouble. Following his stunt at the plaza, he could ill afford to come to the master's attention again. At least not so soon. Just as they were about to turn around and head in the opposite direction, they heard a shout. Luxon spun at the noise. Cadus had seen them, and he and his cronies were hurriedly pushing his way through the flow of pedestrians to reach them. "Run, Yeppert, go!" he shouted, grabbing his friend's arm and hurrying him back the way they had come. What about you?" "I'll be fine," Luxon replied, with more confidence than he actually felt. "Go on, I'll meet you at class." He sighed as he saw the look of determination cross his friend's face. "No, I won't leave you. I'll stay at your side." Luxon clapped his friend on the shoulder. "Your funeral," he said wryly. Both lads turned to face their tormentors. Cadus stood a full inch taller than Luxon, his broad shoulders hinting at his physical strength. His dark eyes were full of malice. His large nose dominated his face. He too wore a blue student's cloak, except his had the emblem of his father emblazoned upon the breast. The cross axes and the red crow of Redbit stood out proudly, allowing all to see that he was under the protection of one of the most powerful lords in Delfinnia. Standing to one side of him was Douglas, a tall, skinny lad with shifty eyes, and on the other was Rudak, a large brute of a boy with a look that said that the lights were on but nobody was at home. Neither of them studied at the schools. Instead, they were in service of Cadus. "Well, well, well, if it isn't the son of the liar and his fat oaf of a lover," Cadus said snidely, eliciting chuckles from his goons. "That's funny, coming from the son of a liar and a traitor," Luxon replied calmly, his steely grey eyes boring deep into his foes. Cadus's false smile immediately dropped, his face reddening with rage. Without warning, he lashed out, and his fist connected with Luxon's nose. Bright white pain shot through Luxon, blinding his vision and causing him to stagger backwards. Yeppert cried out, but Cadus's thugs quickly silenced him. Rudak grabbed the fat lad, putting him in a headlock and muffling his cries with a large hand over his mouth.
Eclin gestured to his friends, and he and Douglas gripped the dazed Luxon under his armpits and hauled him and his struggling friend down a nearby alleyway. Panic started to swell in Luxon's mind. Out of sight of the public, he dreaded to think what Eclin had planned for them. Perhaps calling the bully's father a traitor was a step too far, he thought, and his wits slowly collected themselves. Eclin had a mean right cross. "You snivelling piece of scum!" Eclin snarled, pinning Luxon to the alleyway's wall, an arm pressed against his throat. "My father is the rightful king. He is the strongest baron in all of Delfinnia. The crown is his through strength of arms. You think that just because you are skilled in magic that it will save you. Magic is dead in this world. If you use it outside of this city, the knights of Niverin will gut you like a fish." Luxon was scared. He had never seen Eclin so angry. Out of the corner of his eyes, he could hear Yepet's muted cries as the two thugs beat him yet again. "Your father may be the strongest," Luxon wheezed, "but he is a liar." He winced as he waited for another blow. Perhaps Master Rigis was right when he said that he was too foolhardy. The blow never came. Instead, Eclin was on the ground, his hands around his throat, his face turning blue. Luxon stared in confusion, noticing that Yepet had gone quiet as well. The thugs who had been beating him just moments before were also on the ground. His friend was on his feet, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. The two thugs were in a similar predicament to Eclin. "What's happening, Luxon?" Yepet asked worriedly. By now, Eclin had gone an unnatural colour as he gasped for air. Luxon gasped as he realised his hands were tingling with energy. With horror, he realised that somehow he was responsible. He racked his mind, desperately trying to think of a way to break the spell he had somehow cast. He faced his friend. "Yepet! Hit me!" he shouted in panic as the three bullies began to thrash ever more desperately. His friend hesitated. "Damn it, Yepet, if you don't hit me, they will die. I don't know how, but I'm causing this. I can feel it. I need something to break the spell, and physical harm is one of the most effective ways." Eclin had now turned a livid purple. Luxon shouted out in annoyance as his gentle friend stood there like a frightened rabbit. Spinning, Luxon faced the wall, gritted his teeth, and ran headfirst into the stone wall against which, moments before, he had been pinned against his will. His head connected solidly with the hard stone, and the world went black. "It isn't possible. No one has that ability." Voices drifted into Luxon's consciousness. "He has," responded another, a higher, lighter-pitched voice compared to the first gruffness. "Nonsense! If you compare this boy, this child, to him, then I seriously question your sanity." Luxon stirred. Slowly, he opened his eyes, and immediately regretted doing so. Once more he was lying in the bedchambers of the school. The same painting of Zarnia the Great greeted him, except this time there was no friendly voice to set him at ease. His head throbbed, and he tentatively touched the spot where it had connected with the alleyway's wall. He winced as pain radiated from the wound. Glancing around the room, he could see his robe hanging from the back of the high-backed chair that Master Rigis had sat in during his last visit. The voices were coming from the hallway outside of the room. Gingerly, Luxon sat up. Stars exploded before his vision, causing him to cry out. The voices stopped and the door opened. In walked a woman who Luxon guessed must be the owner of the second voice that drifted into his consciousness. Her long blonde hair framed a delicate face. Her deep blue eyes caused his breath to catch in his throat. She was beautiful. "So, you're finally awake," the woman said, walking over to the bed. "My name is Hannah. I am apprenticed to Master Enil," she explained, as she checked Luxon's bandages. "The Master Healer?" Luxon asked, his mind racing to recognize the name. Hannah gave him a wide smile. Her perfect teeth shone like polished ivory, causing Luxon's heart to beat quickly. "That's right," she answered. From the youthfulness of her skin, Luxon mentally guessed that she must have been only a few years older than himself. He took a wild stab in the dark. She was around 18. "You took a very nasty knock to the head. According to your friend, you deliberately knocked yourself unconscious." She raised an eyebrow questioningly. He was much shaken up when he sought help. Luxon simply shrugged his shoulders. "I had to do it. Something happened. Something that I couldn't control," he added miserably. The memory of what occurred flashed into his mind, and a dreadful thought struck him. "Eclin! The others!" he blurted out, sitting up in panic. "What happened to them? Are they okay?" His head swam again as the concussion threatened to drag him back into the realm of sleep once more. Hannah gently eased her patient back down into the pillows beneath him. She turned to face the door to see that the man she had been talking with earlier had now stepped into the room. He wore a black cloak with the hood up. It was drawn tightly, casting his features in shadow. "Your friends live," the man answered with not a shred of kindness in his deep, gravelly voice. "However, you have broken the law and have been charged with attempted murder under the Act of the Sacred Flame." Luxon gasped. He tried to speak, but this time the darkness took him and he started to fall back into unconsciousness. Hannah rounded on the cloaked man. "Why did you say that? Could it not have waited until he was feeling better? Whatever this lad has done, it is decreed by law that he remains in the healer's custody until he is fit and able to stand trial." The man shrugged nonchalantly. "It matters not. Either way, he will be judged." 3 days passed before Luxon was able to stand without being struck by nausea, or without the world spinning before his eyes. On more than one occasion he had attempted to walk, but had collapsed into a painfully messy heap. The healer's apprentice had looked after him throughout this time of incarceration. At first, he hadn't realized that he had been arrested, but it dawned upon him when Hannah had not allowed anyone to visit him. He had heard Yeppert inquiring about his health before being gently turned away with a polite refusal. Even Master Rigis had not been allowed entry. Luxon was afraid. On the second day, Hannah had told him what he had been charged for. Aside from the claims from Arcadis for attempted murder, he had been brought upon the serious charge of uncontrolled use of magic, a crime that, since the days of the fall of the Golden Empire, meant death for anyone that committed it. Magic wielders were feared in all corners of Delfinnia, except for Calderia. For over 1,000 years, magic had been strictly controlled. It had been magic users that had caused the Empire's fall and brought the world to the brink of annihilation in the magic wars. Witch hunters and the Knights of Niveran scoured the realms in search of those who abused their power, and they hunted the remnants of the wicked things that had been conjured into the world during the wars. Fell beasts, spirits, and other abominations had been unleashed as mage battled mage and wizards waged war upon wizard. Before the War of Succession had begun, mages and wizards had kept mostly to themselves, choosing lives of seclusion in Calderia or using the skills learnt at the city schools to help the peoples of the realm. Wizards and mages were often found as court advisors to the king and his barons, but now even they had been forced to return to Calderia. Those that left Calderia were not allowed to use any magic. To do so would mean certain death. Nightblades were the exception. Often employed as bodyguards or agents, the Nightblades used their skills to do the deeds that a normal person could not. Their main purpose, however, was to hunt the beasts of the void that stalked the realm's dark places. Luxon sat in the room's high-backed chair, racking his brain to figure out what had happened. He had asked Hannah to scour the great library for any tomes that could answer the mystery, but none had contained the information he sought. A tome he had not yet read lay on the small table at his side. The History of Magic, Volume 47, was emblazoned on the cover. He sighed in exasperation and settled into the chair to read the massive tome. Chapter 3. Dungeons of Redbit, Barony of Redbit. Caden wasn't very comfortable, not one bit. His hair was long and unkempt, and his clothes stank with several days' worth of dirt and sweat. The smell of the dank, damp dungeon added to the foul aroma. The fact that he was chained to the small cell's wall meant that he had very little room to maneuver, a fact that had resulted in several unpleasant instances when it came to relieving himself. His once spotless mantle was covered in filth. The gold 7-pointed star on his chest was faded and muddy. Caden was a knight, a member of the Order of Niveran, sworn to defend the weak and to root out heresy. The order had been founded after the end of the bloody War of Magic, a war that had seen the ruin of an empire. Caden had been proud when he had finally been ordained as a knight at the age of 25. Now, 4 years later, he found himself in the flea-ridden dungeons of the Baron of Redbit, the ruthless warlord who laid claim to the throne. His mission had been relatively simple. The people of the country of Redbit had asked the Knights of Niveran to intervene in a dispute between the Baron and his eldest son over the rights to conquered territory. Murmurs were growing that the Baron's eldest son was planning to overthrow his father. Unfortunately for Caden, he had sided with the son, and in his temper the Baron locked him away in the stinking hole that passed for a dungeon. That had been 3 months ago, with no release looking likely. Outside, the war was still raging.
He scratched himself, finding another flea and crushing it between his fingers. Several times he had tried to send a message to his brother knights at the preceptory, but every time the Baron had found out and increased the jail sentence. Caden had eventually given up. At this rate, he'd never get out of here. He longed to breathe fresh air and bathe, to trim his itchy, greasy beard and to make himself feel like the man he once was, respected and feared in equal measure. If his fellow knights could see him now, they would probably collapse from laughter. He knew he was a good swordsman and was skilled in the ways of combat, but now it seemed obvious that he had to work on his powers of diplomacy. The voices of the jailers broke into his thoughts as they came closer to his cell. They stopped outside. Being roughly manhandled and leered over by the two wicked men was a young woman. She looked no more than 19 years old. Her once golden hair was covered in filth, and she looked as though she had been through a very tough time. Caden could appreciate that. "Here, Sir Knight, we found you some company," the fat, bald jailer laughed. His thick beard hid the menacing smile underneath. "A pretty little whore for you to play with. The other cells are full, thanks to the Baron's crackdown on beggars." The skinnier jailer took a set of keys from his belt, unlocked the door and unceremoniously pushed the girl into the cell, causing her to fall into the slop bucket in the centre of the tiny room. She clambered to her knees, coughing and gagging at the smell. Caden watched her with interest. The fire in her eyes was mesmerising. She rounded on the jailers and tried to force her way past them, but the bigger man simply pushed her back to the ground. With a click, the cell was locked, and the two jailers walked away, cackling to one another. "Bastards!" the girl screamed. "Let me out of here!" Another 20 minutes passed with the girl screaming obscenities at the jailers. Finally, Caden had had enough. "They won't listen to you. And where in God's name did you come up with such foul words?" The girl jumped, only just noticing the chained knight on the far wall of the cell. "You startled me. I didn't know you were there," she said nervously. She paused as she remembered what the jailers had said. A look of fear and doubt passed over her face. "I'm no whore, so don't you touch me," she said defiantly. The girl was attractive, even though she was covered in mud and dirt. Her green eyes were mesmerising, and her determination gave her a look of strength. Her golden hair fell to her shoulders, matted and knotted, but nonetheless appealing. Her tunic was ripped, almost revealing her breasts. She covered herself as best she could, and held the torn material in place. "What's your name?" Caden asked. The girl looked at him, curiosity and mistrust in her eyes. "Elira." "Well, Elira, my name is Caden, and I am a knight in the Order of Niveran. I promise I won't hurt you." Elira's eyes went wide as he told her who he was. A look of respect showed in her eyes, which was quickly replaced by suspicion. "What is a knight of Niveran doing in a hole like this?" Caden sighed and told her his story. Afterwards, Elira laughed at the knight's predicament and his foolishness. "I never thought a knight could judge something so badly," she said sarcastically. Caden scowled at her, embarrassed that this peasant girl thought him a fool. "Well then, what's your story?" he asked brusquely. She went to the cell door and checked to see that the jailers were nowhere in sight before she turned to him with a mischievous look in her eyes. "I am a mage," she whispered. Caden stared at the girl in disbelief. "That's impossible. A mage hasn't been seen in these parts for decades. They all went into hiding or fled to the mage realm of Calderia to the far north. And another thing, a mage would never let herself be caught by the Baron of Retbit." He shuddered at the thought. Elira looked at her feet. "I'm not a very good one, okay?" she admitted sadly. "My father died before he could teach me anything important, and I was sent to live with my grandmother when I was 11. She hated magic and she hated me and all of what my father stood for and practiced." Caden nodded his head in sympathy. He too had lost his father when he was young. Sir Frederick of the Marble Shore had been killed in battle against one of the many warlords that threatened the peace of the kingdom. The Knights of Niveran and other orders were constantly fighting to remove them from the world. "It's a pity. I was hoping you were some mighty warlock that could make these goddamn chains remove them from my wrist," Caden replied, jokingly. "You're a Knight of Niveran. Your kind hunts us as much as the others, and yet you joke," the girl said seriously. An awkward silence followed, but for the next 2 days and nights, the two talked and told each other tales. On the dawn of Caden's 5th month of captivity, the Baron of Retbit himself came to the cell.
He was a dour-looking man in his early 50s. His grey and balding head was covered in poxmarks. He was a short man, no more than 5 feet tall, but nonetheless he gave off an imposing aura. Now, as he stood before the cell of the knight who had dared favour his son, he smiled evilly. "I thought you would like to know, Sir Knight, that I have taken the castle at Rook's Peak. The siege was long and costly, but finally my son is in chains. Just like you, in fact," he tittered mirthlessly. "So, now that my quarrel with you is over, I've decided to release you. Your imprisonment no longer amuses me, and your fellow knights have begun sniffing about asking questions, a distraction I can ill afford whilst I press my advantage in the war." Caden stared at the Baron, a mixture of relief and hatred coursing through him. "You make a big mistake imprisoning me, Baron," Caden growled back. "My brothers will not look kindly on what you did. You can be sure the council will take the castle back from you. After all, a knight of Nyviren's decision is the law." Elira was hiding behind Caden. The months of imprisonment had gone badly for her. The jailers had treated her badly, and the lack of food made her gaunt and pale. The Baron snorted derisively. "We shall see, knight, we shall see. Be assured that you have an enemy here in this country. If I hear of you setting foot here ever again, I will cut off your balls and feed them to you." He nodded to the jailers. Warily they unlocked the chain holding Caden to the wall. The months of being chained to the wall by the wrists had left him weak, and his muscles had wasted away. He rubbed at his wrists, trying to get the blood flowing once more. Fortunately, it was his left wrist that had wasted, and not his sword arm. Caden was about to leave when Elira sobbed, stopping him in his tracks. "What about the girl?" he asked. "So, the so-called pure knight has taken a fancy to the little whore, has he? Well, you can have the little witch. Tell your fellow knights that I'm merciful." Caden scowled at the Baron. That was too easy, he thought. Elira clung to him, and instantly his doubts evaporated. Once more he addressed the Baron. He hoped it would be for the last time. "Fair enough," he said. "I will tell my brothers of your mercy and generosity." The Baron nodded silently and stepped aside as the knight and the whore limped past him. He stared at their backs as they were escorted out of the dungeon. When they were out of earshot, the Baron gestured to his lieutenant. "Make sure that Whoreson doesn't leave this country alive," he snarled. "The Knights of Nyviren must not find out about this. Kill him. Make sure the girl is unharmed." After their release, Caden and Elira made their way through the shit-covered streets of the city of Retbit, the county's capital. "Thank you for not leaving me to rot back there," Elira said, finally breaking the awkward silence that had descended over the two of them. Caden looked at her and smiled. "Think nothing of it. Just doing my knightly duty," he said with a roguish smile. "First thing we have to do is get a horse and get the hell out of this cursed country. You can be sure that the knights will not take the Baron's actions lightly. I never believed they would besiege that castle and cast its very own son in chains." Caden spoke sadly. The entire situation was his fault. His poor attempt at trying to resolve the dispute had led the country to the brink of civil war. It was dusk by the time the two reached the stable where Caden had paid for his horse to be looked after. He had given the stable owner a large sum of gold to keep the animal safe, and luckily for Caden, they had kept their word, even after his long incarceration. The large warhorse whinnied as he spoke to it in calming tones. It was a black gelding, one of the finest breeds from the plains of Bison. "She's beautiful," Elira exclaimed excitedly. Caden paid the stable boy with the gold he had recovered from his hiding spot at the side of the road leading out of the town. It was always a precaution the knights took just in case of capture. After all, they made for a valuable ransom prize. Harold was the name of his horse, and now it stood saddled and covered in the mantle of Nyviren. The mantle's colour was bright and clean in comparison to his own messy and filth-covered one. Caden helped lift Elira into the saddle. Afterwards, he rooted in the hay bale in Harold's pen. "What are you doing?" Elira inquired. "Aha! There you are, my pretty," Caden exclaimed as he picked up his sword from its burial place. It had been carefully wrapped in a thick cloth to prevent it rusting, and aside from some dirt, it was in near perfect condition. The long, broad blade was a thing of beauty, as was the small red diamond on the pommel. "Hopefully we won't need this, but I don't trust that bastard Baron as far as I could throw him." With that, the two rode along the road outwards to the priory of Nyviren. The two horsemen had waited patiently for hours.
Boredom was setting in as they watched the dirt road for any sign of their prey. The Baron had been explicit with his instructions. The knight was to die, and the girl was to be sent back to him as his prize. A mage was worth a lot of ransom money, and the market for mage slaves had increased tenfold during the past year. No one seemed to know why, and the slavers weren't about to ask. Rumours had spread that things were happening in the lands beyond the borders of the kingdom. Finally, a lone horse came into view. A man and a small woman were on its back. They were laughing and joking, despite their haggard appearance. The taller of the men pulled up his cloak's hood and drew his sword from its scabbard. "We go now!" he snarled, and with that he and his companion spurred their horses and galloped into the centre of the road. The knight slowed his horse and grasped the hilt of his own sword. "Stay here," Caden murmured to Elira, who looked at the horseman in fear. He dismounted and raised his arm to hail the two mysterious riders. "Gentlemen," he began, "you seem to be blocking the road. My companion and I must continue on this route. As a knight of Navarran, I must insist you allow us to carry on our way." The two riders laughed at his insolence. "Let's kill this arrogant bastard," the hooded man snarled. His colleague nodded in agreement. They were hired killers, born and bred in the rough and dilapidated slums of Retbit, thugs who did anything for coin. Killing a knight meant no more to them than roughing up a family or burning down someone's livelihood. The riders spurred their horses and charged at Caden, who had now drawn his sword. The hooded rider aimed his blade at the knight's head, and with a battle cry swung it with all of his might. Caden ducked at the last second, and from his crouch rose to his feet and ripped his sword through the charging horse's exposed flank. The blade cut deep, and blood sprayed from the wounded beast. Its rider was sent flying and crashed to the ground in a heap. Caden spun about and saw the second rider charging at him. There was no way to avoid the arching swing of the man's axe. He chided himself on his weakness. If he was at his peak, he would have dispatched the two vagabonds with ease. But the months of incarceration had slowed his wits and weakened his body. He said a silent prayer and closed his eyes as the axe drew closer and closer. But just as the blade would surely take his head from his body, there was a blast of sound, and a strange sensation as all the hairs on his arms stood up. He waited for a few seconds, disbelieving that he still lived, and then slowly opened his eyes. There in front of him, where his attacker had been, was a smouldering pile of ash. Both rider and horse had been disintegrated. Gaping at the sight, he jumped when he heard Elira gasping for air. The girl was still sat on his horse, but her hair was standing up and frazzled. She was breathing rapidly, and steam emanated from her hands. "By the gods! Was that you?" Caden asked. Elira simply nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Taught nothing good, my arse," Caden joked lamely. He hurried to her and held her as she sobbed. "I killed him. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to scare him is all." Caden hugged her. He had never witnessed the power of magic before, and all the doubts he had had about the girl's story evaporated as he held her. "It's all right, love. Those buggers would have killed us given the chance. I owe you my life," he said gratefully. Caden released her and jumped back down to the road. He kicked over the body of the hooded rider, whose spine had been broken by his horse throwing him awkwardly onto the hard surface of the road. Reaching into the cloak, he found a bag of silver coins and a small note with the seal of Baron of Retbit. Unsurprised, Caden remounted his horse, and they began their journey again. Chapter 4. Sunguard. The palace remained a ruin. Even 3 years after the assassins had burnt it to the ground, it stayed an empty, blackened husk. Masonry continued to crumble, and, during a large storm in the previous year, the Hall of Kings had collapsed. An ancient structure that had survived for millennia was now just a heap of rubble. It was a fitting place to announce a new king. A small crowd had gathered on the cliff top, ushered into place by soldiers of the Legion. General Rayson smiled as the privy councillors were roughly thrown to the ground before him, their cries of protest quickly made silent by the pommels of soldiers' swords connecting with their skulls. Rayson struck a powerful figure. His golden plate armour gave him an aura of invincibility as he stalked up and down the line of councillors. His grey tonsured hair was offset with a sharp pointed nose, and his steel-grey eyes belied a keen and savage intellect. "For 3 years I have fought for you, noble men," the general said, sneering at the pathetic bunch cowering at his feet. "I led the remnants of the King's Legion through the blood and filth of the grasslands. I routed the Baron of Balnor at the Battle of the Golden Hills, and what did I get for my troubles?" The general faced the grim-faced legionaries standing to attention behind the councillors and the crowd of cowering civilians. Legionaries were men who respected power and authority, but most of all, they respected strong leadership. With the death of the king, and with no heir, the legion had turned on itself. The capital had almost ripped itself apart as cohort turned on cohort. They called it the Night of Tears, a night when 20,000 men, women and children perished. The scars of that night were still evident in the city. 2 whole districts remained wrecked. Bloodstains could still be seen on the streets, and the rains having little impact cleansing it away, the people would simply obey. Rayson turned back to the nobles. "I saved this city. I saved you," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Foolishly, I put my trust in you, good men, to restore order, to safeguard the throne for the one who was worthy. Instead, what did we get?" "Lies! Weakness!" his legionaries shouted in response. Rayson smiled wickedly at the men kneeling before him. "Yes, that is exactly what we got. Instead of taking charge, of asserting your authority over the realm, you allowed it to be torn apart by the barons and their petty squabbles. Now we have 6 claimants, all tearing Delfinnia apart. This is something—" His voice rose in volume as he shouted out, "This is something I cannot allow!" He put a boot on the neck of one of the terrified councillors. "Do none of you contest my judgment? That you are all sniffling cowards? That I am the only one who can bring order back to this realm? That only I can save Delfinnia?" Only sobs and pitiful cries answered him. He laughed, mocking their weakness. "No one has the courage to stop me," he said, disbelievingly. He was amazed at himself that he had been willing to follow their orders for so long. He was the last general willing to do what was necessary. If he did not force the realm to heel under his boot, then Delfinnia would surely be lost. "You have no right to the crown," said a deep voice from the crowd of onlookers. Rayson spun to face the cowering peasants. His face grew purple with rage at the audacity that a peasant, no less, would speak out against him. He raised his fist and thrust it at the crowd. Immediately the legionaries drew their swords. Women and children screamed, and the men shouted in protest as the soldiers waded into the crowd, violently shoving and punching whoever got in their way. The peasants scattered, fleeing back down the cliff path to safety. All of them, save one. A hooded, cloaked man stood his ground. "And who are you to say such a thing?" Rayson said menacingly as his men approached the man. His legionaries smirked to one another. The man was obviously mad to defy their general in so public a place. The man threw back his hood to reveal the face of a ghost. Rayson took an involuntary step backwards as he recognized the former commander of the king's bodyguard. The great warrior Davik stood before him. He looked the same as he had always done, save from a scar that ran from his left cheek and down into his neck. The grizzled old veteran glared at Rayson and the legionaries, as though daring them to attack. "You're supposed to be dead, Davik. You died the same night as the king and his family." Rayson sputtered in disbelief. 1,000 thoughts whirled through the general's mind. Davik had been a friend. So where had he been all this time? "I got better," Davik replied simply. The legionaries looked to each other in confusion, unsure how to react to this revelation. "This war has raged on for long enough. I had hoped to wait and see who the realm's true enemies were, but now I see that before then we will destroy ourselves by infighting." Davik smiled. "An heir to the Sundered Crown yet lives, Rayson." The general took another step back at his former comrade's revelation. He'd been planning this coup for 2 years. He could not stop now, not with the crown so close to his grasp. If he freed the Privy Council or welcomed this heir, he would no doubt lose his head. Too much blood had been spilt for him to stop now. "I've put too much on the line to stop now, old friend. I will be king, and I will save our realm." Rayson paused, offering a hand to Davik. "Join me, and together we can restore order to Delfinnia." Davik glared at the man he had once called friend. He glanced from legionary to legionary, catching each of the man's eyes in turn. None could bear to hold his gaze for long. "You pledged your loyalty to the king's legion, and I say a true king yet lives," Davik said to them, "and enemies greater than the barons are waiting in the wings. Would you forsake it all for your general's lust for power?" None of them answered. "My men are loyal to me, Davik," Rayson said. "Under my rule, all enemies, whether real or concocted in your age-addled mind, will be destroyed." A sad look crossed Rayson's face. "I'm sorry, my friend, but I cannot allow you to leave this place alive. If word of this so-called heir got out, then, well, my rule will not be accepted by the people now, would it?" Davik frowned. He knew what would happen now. His right hand edged to the sword on his hip, unseen under the cloak. "Kill him!" Rayson barked as he drew his own sword. With a speed that startled the legionaries, Davik whipped his blade out of its scabbard and buried it deep into the nearest legionary's throat. Blood erupted from the dying man's throat as Davik ripped his sword away. He spun, countering a thrust and bringing his knee hard into the face of another attacker, who fell to the ground, his nose shattered. He might have been old, but Davik had been in more battles than he could count, and the young legionaries didn't have the skill or experience. He pivoted on his left foot, spinning around to face the rest of his attackers. He glanced behind him to see the full platoon of troops hastily marching up the hill, their spears at the ready. Davik swore under his breath. He had been far too reckless. 2 legionaries charged towards him. He ducked the first's wild swing and stabbed his own blade savagely into the man's gut. The metal slid in, underneath the legionary armour and deep into the meat. The man squealed in agony and crumpled to the ground in a messy heap. Davik stepped over the corpse, ducked the second attacker's thrust, rotated his wrists and brought his sword down onto the legionary's wrist, slicing clean through the bone and sending him crashing into the ground in a whimper. Rayson felt a twinge of fear at seeing his men being bested by the famous warrior, but breathed a sigh of relief as the cohort crested the hill. 1 man against 50. The old fool wouldn't stand a chance. Arrogantly, he turned his back on his new enemy and turned his attention back to the councillors who sat stunned at the sight of the legendary old commander battling his former comrades. The general gestured to the 2 legionaries guarding the councillors. "Kill them too," he said with not a hint of emotion in his voice. If murder was what it took to become king, it didn't bother him. Rather he was king than some fool baron or some mysterious claimant. The lady's prophecy had to be fulfilled. The soldiers drew their swords, setting upon the defenceless councillors with a brutal determination. Each of their screams was silenced as cold steel took their lives in a spray of blood. "No!" Davik screamed at the sight. He was holding off the cohort, who edged towards him warily, the sight of their dead colleagues checking any foolish charge. He stood, stunned at the sight of the slaughter. Madness had descended upon Delfinnia, a madness that would play into the hands of the realm's true enemies. With a roar of anger, Davik attacked the cohort. His arm was a flurry of swings and thrusts as he hacked and slashed his way through the soldiers. A single thought filled his mind. Rayson would pay. Despair filled him. He had been counting on Rayson to hear him out about the fears, about the night when the royal family died. Foolishly, he had hoped that together they would restore the legion and exact vengeance upon those who had hired the assassins. Now, all that was left of the man he had once trusted was a lust for power. Rayson had lost his soul through murder and savagery. A spear stabbed painfully into Davik's side, knocking the wind out of his chest. He staggered, grabbing the spear shaft to steady himself, and plunged his sword into the spearman's throat. Blood poured from Davik's wound. If he didn't find a way to escape, then he would surely die. He edged the fight towards the steep cliff edge. Below lay the sprawling city of Sundered, its high towers glinting in the sunlight. On any other day, he would be thanking the gods for such a splendid sight. Now, however, he prayed for something else entirely. He pressed his attack, forcing the soldiers back until they reached the side of the steep path. Madly, he glanced onwards. The drop must have been over 200 feet at least. He closed his eyes in acceptance. There was no other way. With one last look at Rayson, Davik whispered a silent prayer to Nyveron before stepping backwards off the cliff's edge. Chapter 5. The journey took almost 4 whole days, and on the eve of the last they finally saw the priory of Nyveron. The 2 high towers of its battlements made an imposing sight compared to the beauty of its surroundings. The priory was in some respects like a small town. It contained a variety of craftsmen, and it owned the surrounding farmland. The large walls and castle stood on a hill that allowed it to tower above the other buildings that were needed to keep the order of Nyveron running. Surrounding it was Lake Sumil, its shimmering waters only adding to the scenes of beauty. Caden reined in his horse and admired the view. He turned to Elira. "Only gods could have made such a place," he said. "A fitting home for our order, is it not?" He was happy that he was close to his home, yet he saw Elira had a sad look on her face. The ordeal on the road had scarred her deeply. "What's the matter?" Caden asked, concern showing on his face. Elira slumped in the saddle. "I won't be safe there," she said. "You are a knight of Neveran, and I'm a mage. Your people hunt down my kind, and I fear I would hurt someone else. The power I felt was like nothing I've ever felt before. It scares me." She wiped a tear from her eye. "No, it terrifies me," she said tearfully. Caden was about to try and reassure her that she would be safe, that he would protect her, when a rider in a sergeant's uniform hailed them. "Wait here," Caden said. "We can discuss this later when we've had a good meal and some sleep. That's the least I can offer the lady who saved my life." He dismounted and the sergeant trotted closer. "Hail, Sir Caden! One of our scouts saw you whilst travelling back from Retbit." Caden nodded. They had seen a rider yesterday. He had given them some wine, but didn't have time to share any news. "He seemed to be in quite a hurry." "Yes, the Grand Master sent him to deliver a message to the Baron of Retbit demanding your release, but on his arrival you had already been set free. The Grand Master has recalled all of the knights back to the Priory." The sergeant was a young man of no more than 18. On seeing Elira, he seemed to forget Caden was even there. "Yes, she's a pretty one," Caden said. "Now, Sergeant, please tell me, why is the Grand Master recalling the order?" The sergeant snapped his attention back to Caden. "Sorry," he said, blushing before regaining his composure. "The Grand Master is recalling the order because he's preparing to go to war." "War? By God, what has happened?" Caden asked, a sense of dread knotting in his stomach. "New intelligence has come to the Grand Master's attention. Apparently, he knows who was responsible for hiring the assassins that murdered the royal family and started the war for the crown." It was an ominous-looking day when Caden awoke. Large, dark clouds filled the sky, bringing the promise of rain. It was nice to be back in a comfortable bed and to be fed well, but he was most happy about his chance to clean and trim his beard. The bell for morning prayer rang out in the courtyard, a tradition that had existed since the Order's founding. Caden pulled on his tunic, breeches and boots before walking to his closet and taking out a brand new mantle. The white and gold almost shone, it was so new. Finally, he picked up his sword and attached the scabbard to his belt. He was still tired after having to stay up until midnight, talking with the masters of the Order about his imprisonment and of Elira. None of them liked the idea of having a woman capable of magic in the Priory, but they all agreed they would allow her to stay for a time in respect for her rescue of their brother knight. As for the Baron of Retbit, he could wait, as other events were taking place. The baronies were on the verge of escalating the war. With the Baron of Balnor's defeat at the Gold Hills, the route to the capital was now open for the Baron of Champia to make his move northward, and Retbit would surely not waste his chance to try and take Sungard. Hiding behind the capital's walls was the Privy Council, who were rapidly losing control of the realm. Even those in the King's Legion that remained loyal were said to be manoeuvring to launch a coup d'etat. Rumours were also spreading that the baronies of Bison and Robinta had fallen under attack from rampaging warlords, and in the far north, the mounting kingdom of Eclin had sent messages for aid to the rest of the realm, telling of felbeasts that had been ravaging its towns and villages. The details were far too vague for the knights to understand, though, so only a few scouts had been dispatched to the region. Caden walked down the chapter house's long passageway, passing several other knights and squires along the way. Eventually, he reached the small room where Elira had been billeted. He gently tapped on the door. "Come in," came her voice. Caden opened the large oak door and saw Elira sitting at the small dressing table brushing her long golden hair. She wore a long shift dress of royal blue and smiled as she saw him. His heart almost skipped a beat. She was beautiful. Composing himself by clearing his throat, he said, "Morning. I hope you slept well. Have my brother knights treated you well? I am sorry I haven't come to see you before, but I've been very busy." She smiled. "I understand. I've been treated very well. And for an order that isn't supposed to have women, I was surprised to see such a lovely collection of dresses." Despite her happiness, Caden could see the rings under her eyes. She had been having nightmares ever since the incident on the road. It was something that she would have to deal with and accept. That would come in time, he knew. He still remembered the first time he had killed a man. He could see the victim's face every time he fell asleep. But over time, he'd come to accept what he had done. Killing to save others was something he could live with. After all, that was what Naverin commanded. Caden laughed and pushed those thoughts out of his mind. Well, the Order often receive visits from noble ladies in need of our aid, although some of my brothers do bring their wives here on occasion. Anyhow, I was going to tell you that the Grand Master has called another council. More knights have arrived, and he believes the Order cannot wait any longer. Elira was scared. She had never seen a war before. She had seen the refugees and the resulting chaos a few times in her short life. Being brought up on the borderlands, there was always some conflict or other being fought by the barons and dukes. But this was different. She could feel it. Something had changed in the world, something she couldn't quite place. But the mage in her knew it was terribly wrong. "What's the matter?" Caden asked, as he saw the haunted look on her face. Distractedly, she shook her head as if coming out of a daze. "I'm not sure. I just have a strange feeling is all. My dreams are filled with places and people I've never seen before. But all have been tainted by magic, or at least that's what it feels like. I don't know. I'm probably just being foolish." "You have the blood of a mage within you, Elira," Caden said. "That's not something to dismiss. I've heard old tales that some mages could see glimpses of places and events, in some cases the future. I tell you what, I'll discuss this with the Grand Master. He's the keeper of the Order's knowledge of magic and the mages. Perhaps he could find out something." "Thank you, Caden. You were too kind." "No problem. I'd best be on my way to prayers. You're welcome to join me. Perhaps Naverin can give you some answers." Elira agreed, and the two of them walked together towards the chapel and to morning prayer. Over 300 knights were gathered in the priory's courtyard. Many had travelled from all around, and rumour was rife. Caden and Elira stood at the back of the crowd, awaiting Grand Master Thondril's arrival. The crowd fell silent once the masters stepped into the makeshift podium.
"Brother knights," the Grand Master boomed, "we have recalled you back here because the kingdom stands on the verge of destruction. An unknown enemy assails the land. Assassins killed the king and queen, sowing the roots of mistrust and war amongst the realm. Rumors of death and evil come from the northern mountains. Ancient rivalries threaten to divide us further. Word has reached us that the Privy Council has been overthrown, and yet another usurper has claimed the throne."
The crowd of knights gave out a roar of protest and anger as they heard the news. Caden was shocked at how quickly the situation in the world was worsening.
"We can no longer stay neutral in this war. We will not fight for those claiming the crown. Instead, we will do as Naverin commanded, and will do what we can to protect the helpless. The fell beasts and dark magic users long hidden from the world will no doubt use this time of chaos to strike, and so it falls to us to carry out our sacred duty."
Suddenly, Elira gave out an ear-piercing cry and collapsed to the ground. Caden immediately knelt down to her and cradled her in his arms. The other knights nearby all turned their attention to the girl who was now writhing on the ground. Elira! Elira, what's wrong? What's happening?" Caden cried desperately. Flashes of horrific images screamed through Elira's mind. War, death, terrible creatures rendering men and women limb from limb. Their screams of agony reverberating in her ears. The screams turned into a wailing, which then merged and changed into the cry of a child. She saw a woman, scared and alone, clutching a small child to her chest as a dark shadow appeared over them. Then there was a blinding flash. A halo of white light surrounded the child, casting back the darkness. A roar of anger, and then suddenly a robed figure appeared in the image. His face was white and decayed with eyes of pure black. Tendrils of darkness emanated from him, and his fury was aimed at the child. A figure stepped out from the light and raised a sword high into the air. Light and fire blossomed forth, driving back the robed figure's fury.
"Adelaide, Luxon,"
whispered a malevolent voice. Elira gasped awake. She sat up suddenly only to see the concerned face of Caden and the other knights. Caden sighed in relief. "Elira, thank God. Are you all right?" The Grand Master had stopped speaking as the commotion spread through the crowd.
"Sir Caden, what is happening?"
he demanded. Caden called for a healer and told the Master of Elira's collapse. Quickly, 3 knights picked up the dazed girl and carried her to the Priory's infirmary. Elira explained all that she had seen in her vision to the gathered masters. She was seated in the Grand Master's chamber. Once she had finished, Caden asked, "Masters, is it possible the vision was magical in origin? Since we left Retbit, Elira has been experiencing more and more magical activity." The Grand Master glanced at the others. The vision had shaken them all.
"Sir Caden, what I am about to tell you cannot leave this chamber."
He cleared his throat before continuing.
"The name Adelaide was the name of the king's youngest child, a boy who was no more than a few weeks old. It was thought that he had perished during the attack on the royal family and the destruction of the palace 3 years ago. Very few of the commoners or even nobility knew the child's name. The birth of a child 5th in line to the crown isn't normally seen as that important."
Elira sat stunned. The name she had heard was a real person. "If the child's alive, then they're in grave danger," she cried.
"If that's the case, and the child does indeed live, then he is the true and rightful heir to the kingdom,"
one of the masters said.
"If that's the case, then we must inform the diasect,"
said another.
"They must verify if the prince still lives and bring him to safety."
The Grand Master nodded in agreement.
"Yes, we will send word to the diasect about this, and we must discover more about Elira's vision. Sir Caden and Elira will travel to Calderia and find out what the mages may know of these troubling visions."
He paused, thinking.
"What of the other name? Luxon, was it?"
Caden shook his head.
"I've never heard of such a person. But, whoever they are,
they must be important." Chapter 6. The high ceiling of the crystal Tower of Judgment was spellbinding. Orbs of bright light flitted and flew among the rafters in a rainbow of colours. The balls of magic were said to have been cast by Zani himself 1,000 years ago as a test of his power. The mage lights had lasted for a millennia, attesting to the long-dead wizard's connection to his power. Others said that the lights were simply created early every morning by the masters as they warmed up for the day ahead. If it was them, then they kept it a closely guarded secret. A month had passed before the trial had finally been confirmed by the Council of Masters. With the war raging in the outside world, the masters had been kept exceptionally busy by tending to the city's needs. Remaining a neutral party was proving hard, as each of the claimants were pressing to enlist the power of the mages to their cause. Luxon stood on a raised platform facing a long crystal table. Sat behind it, grim-faced and serious, were 5 of the city's masters. Each was the leader of their specific school. To the far right was Master Dufferin, the head of the School of Illusion. His bald head was tattooed in a plethora of mystical-looking patterns. His piercing green eyes regarded Luxon with amused interest. Sat at his side was Master Phi Odor, the man of the School of Alteration. His big, bushy black beard and raggedy hair hid virtually all of his features. Only his small grey eyes could be seen poking through his hair. On the far left sat Master Enil, of the School of Healing. He gave Luxon a reassuring smile. For a master, Enil was remarkably young, perhaps no older than 30 at the most. His head of red hair mixed strangely with his yellowish eyes. Luxon nodded to the master, thankful to have a potential ally on the judging panel. Hannah had told him that Enil had taken a keen interest in him. When he asked why, Hannah had shrugged his shoulders, but something in her eyes made Luxon curious. Sat next to Enil was Master Kvar of the School of Transmutation. The man had a reputation for being slightly mad, and Luxon understood why. Kvar was the skinniest man he had ever seen. The master's robes hung loosely about his body. Under a head of long, unkempt white hair, Kvar's eyes were always darting around as though he was looking for something. It was said that transmutation often had a strong impact on the caster's mind. After all, turning things into something else required a huge mental strain. The centre seat was empty and reserved for the Grand Master. Luxon looked over his shoulder to see Hannah, Yeppert, and to his surprise, Master Ryges, sat in the small gathering of folk who had come to watch the proceedings. Yeppert looked petrified, but Hannah gave him a reassuring smile. Luxon twiddled his thumbs nervously. Aside from himself and the masters, the hall was filling up with other mages and even a couple of Nightblades. His nerves were threatening to get the better of him, and he itched to run away. But that thought was immediately quashed as he heard the heavy metal doors to the chamber close with a loud thud. He turned in his seat to see Grand Master Thanos stride towards the master's table. Thanos looked remarkably young for the title that he held. No older than 40 at most, But, as with all things magic, not everything was as it seemed. The Grand Master was tall and strong, with a head of thinning black hair. His serious eyes were a bright blue, as though magic flowed through them. Thanos stepped up onto the raised platform and raised his arm to signal that the hearing was about to start. Those in the small crowd stopped their whispering, their eyes all focusing on Luxon and the Masters. Thanos spoke in a clear, assertive voice. He pointed a finger at Luxon, who shrank back under the Grand Master's gaze.
"We are gathered here, in the Tower of Judgment, to determine whether this student is guilty of committing the serious crime of attempted murder," the crowd murmured at that, "and the crime of uncontrolled use of magic." Thanos sat in the center chair, his hands resting limply on the table's smooth surface. "Luxon of Edios, son of Garrick Edios and Drusilla Edios, you have heard the accusations against you. How do you plead?"
Thanos' tone was grave and threatening. Luxon swallowed. His mouth suddenly felt dry. It took all of his courage to stand and say in a clear voice, "Not guilty, my masters." Another murmur came from the crowd.
"Very well," Thanos bellowed. "Bring in the first witness."
A side door creaked open, and in walked Eclin, a smirk on his face. Luxon felt his stomach fall. His enemy had him right where he wanted him. The trial went on for the better part of the day. Eclin greatly exaggerated the incident, and basically branded Luxon and Yeppert as the bullies and the aggressors. The more he had exaggerated, the less scared Luxon became. He knew that all the Masters were aware of Eclin' reputation, so they would surely never believe him. The other boys who had been injured in the fray also gave their testimonies, but due to their stupidity, neither one of their stories matched up. In one, Luxon had used telekinesis to knock them all onto the ground. In the other, he had muttered a dark incantation. Luxon was glad the boys had not been allowed to see one another until the trial. They hadn't had a single opportunity to come up with a lie. Ironically, if they had just told the truth, then things would probably have been worse. Once the boys had given their testimony, it was the turn of the defence. Yeppert told the truth of what had happened, and Master Rigus vouched for them both. It hadn't taken the Masters long to pronounce Luxon innocent of the charge of attempted murder. Thanos stood and addressed the court.
"Now we come to the charge of uncontrolled magic use. We would ask that all non-essential mages and onlookers leave the court."
After a few minutes, the chamber was empty, leaving Luxon all alone to face the Masters. Then, to his surprise, all of the Masters, except for Thanos, left as well.
"We have heard some interesting things about you, Luxon," Thanos said. "Your teacher, Master Rigus, assures us that you are one of the most naturally gifted students he has ever met. That somehow magic comes as naturally to you as eating or drinking. Do you know of Zarnia the Great?" Thanos asked.
Luxon nodded his head in the affirmative. "Yes, Master, I do. Everyone has, haven't they?" Thanos smiled. The Grand Master sat casually on the crystal table's surface, his legs just about touching the ground.
"Zarnia was just a boy, no older than you are now, before he entered into legend. You see, he lived in a time long before Delfinnia even existed as a kingdom. In his day, darkness ruled the world. He was born with a gift so great that he was able to defy the darkness and eventually defeat it. With his power, he was proclaimed a king, and it was he that founded the Golden Empire. Magic can change the world, both for good and for ill."
Thanos paused. The Grand Master looked around the room as though he was listening to something. Luxon strained his ears, but couldn't hear a thing. A few moments of uneasy silence passed before Thanos' attention once more focused upon the boy before him. "What you did to those boys is the reason why the ordinary folk fear our kind." Thanos held up a hand to stop Luxon's reply. "You were lucky none of them were killed, and you were smart enough to do what was necessary to stop it." Luxon looked at his hands, dumbfounded. But Master, I couldn't control it. The magic just happened," he said miserably, tears threatening to fall from his eyes. Thanos' expression softened. The tall wizard walked over to Luxon and placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "In time, you will learn to control it, Luxon. What you have is a very rare gift, one that only a few possess.
You are quite possibly the first true thaumaturgist to have appeared in this world in several generations. It is a gift that enables you to do magic without the need for spells or incantations. Luxon raised his head and looked at his master in confusion. How is that possible? He asked. Thanos smiled. The magic within you is like a second skin, Luxon. It is a reflex to you, just like when you blink or your knee jerks when hit with a healer's hammer. To me, and everyone else, magic is something that we must spend decades in near constant practice to bring such power out in us. It is a gift, Luxon, one that is both wondrous and terrifying in equal measure. Luxon frowned at that. Terrifying? I don't like the sound of that, he muttered. A thought entered his mind. If magic is a reflex to me, why has it only come to me like that now? Thanos began pacing up and down the chamber.
Your life was in danger. Simple as that. Is it not a reflex to fight or flee when threatened?
Your gift is dangerous if not controlled. I emptied the chamber because I did not want your ability to become common knowledge. Unsavoury folks of all kind would no doubt attempt to take advantage of your gifts. In that respect, I will be taking you on as my apprentice in order to teach you how to control your power. As for Arcadus and his oafs, they will be expelled from this city and returned to Redpit. Too many times I've had to deal with the consequences of that boy's misdemeanours. Luxon was stunned. He was being let off, and he was going to obtain the rank of apprentice. An apprentice to Grand Master Thanos, no less. He didn't know what to say. So instead, he smiled. Chapter 7. Mountains of Eclin. In the scarce scrub of the mountain pass, 2 rangers watched and waited. Howling winds battered the senses, and the blizzard caused a near whiteout. Dressed in their grey robes and cowls, they were almost indistinguishable amongst the landscape. Karlok shifted uncomfortably, his hands tensing and relaxing on the shaft of his longbow. His silent companion was as still as a statue, his grey and hard eyes never leaving the scene unfolding on the plain far below. "How much longer must we wait, Woven?" Karlok mumbled to the stern-looking older man. "It's been hours now." Woven glanced at his comrade with an annoyed look on his face. "We wait until they've all passed. Down there is an army likes of which we've never seen before." The 2 rangers had been dispatched to the mountain regions after reports flooded in of massacres and a terrifying enemy. For days the region of Eclin had been besieged. Towns and cities north of the mountains had fallen silent as thousands of refugees fled the horror that was quickly consuming the land. Baron Lido had ordered his forces to defend and barricade the mountain passes that led to the south, to Delfinnia's capital and heartlands. The reports of spectres and monsters had at first been scorned as mere panic-induced rumour, but after survivors from the garrison of the mountain forts collaborated with the testimony of the refugees, fear had truly set in. Down in the valley, a seemingly never-ending column of black-armoured figures marched. Their destination, the barricade at Fuayo Pass. "They look like men to me," Karlok said as he shifted slightly. "Yes. Wait, look there," Woven whispered. "By Neveran. It can't be." There, unbelievably, was a shambling horde of people. At first glance they looked like prisoners of war, men and women, but Woven's keen eyes could see what they truly were. The faint stains of red on the snow around them were the first clues. It was blood. Many were headless, stumbling and staggering as they followed the armoured troops. Then came the sound. It was the moans and cries of souls in torment, and it emanated from those walking corpses still with heads and throats able to unleash the bone-chilling sound. They numbered in their thousands. All of those people were killed in towns and villages. Then they were brought back, Woven said. Karlok stared in terror. He remembered the horror stories his grandfather used to tell him and his brothers when they were small, sat around the fire on those long, cold winter nights. Tales of the dark mage's magic and the Great War. Magic! It has to be. The darkest of all. A roar caught the rangers' attention. Below their hiding spot, 2 rapidly approaching horrors came. Snarling beasts with thick fur, razor-sharp claws and talons of steel. "Werewolves!" Karlok warned. The creatures were rare, but not unknown in the mountain regions. They were the remnants of the magic wars, men cursed by dark mages in battle,
For centuries the beasts had roamed the peaks, picking off the unwary traveller. "They have our scent," Woven swore and drew his bow. "Let's move. There could be scouts for that army." The two rangers quickly clambered down from the overhang and ran through the dense brush. Naked trees with their sharp twigs and limbs tore at their clothes as the two men bounded down the mountainside. "Hurry!" Woven shouted as his companions stumbled in the snow. The beasts were fast approaching. Their panting breaths and snarls sounded close. Karlach picked himself up and scrambled back onto his feet, almost falling again as the thick snow shifted under his weight. Panicking now, he glanced over his shoulder to see the two wolves closing fast. The beasts' fearsome muzzles were full of razor-sharp fangs, and saliva poured from their snarling jaws. "Down!" Woven shouted, just as one of the creatures leapt at Karlach's back, talons extended for the kill. The creature covered the large distance in a single bound, almost taking the elder ranger by surprise. But Woven was a man of the mountains. His entire life had been spent hunting and fighting amongst the frigid peaks. Instinct was his greatest ally in what was often a blizzard-filled landscape, a place where the senses often failed or deceived. He notched an arrow, drew back the longbow's cord and loosed. He shot with hardly taking aim. He never had to. After years of practice and use, he shot the bow from reflex alone. Karlach turned as the werewolf flew at him. Just as he thought he would surely die, Woven's arrow struck the beast. With a howl of pain, the creature lost its momentum and crashed into the ground at Karlach's feet. The arrow had pierced the creature's thick hide and its heart. Karlach spun around as he heard the second wolf snarling, his adrenaline now pumping and buoyed up by his friend's kill of the first. He drew his own bow. The remaining werewolf was more patient and cautious than its deceased companion had been. Slowly it circled the young ranger, its feral eyes never leaving those of the man before it. Despite the cold, sweat poured down Karlach's face, almost blinding him. The monster before him continued circling, just waiting to strike. Its fangs looked like knives, capable of rending flesh with ease. Its coarse, thick fur was aglow with ethereal, cursed energy. Karlach slowly notched an arrow to his bowstring. He didn't want to startle the creature into attacking. He could see Woven moving slowly behind the beast, a new arrow strung on his great longbow. Delicately, Karlach took aim and drew back his cord. His breathing was deafening, and his heart pounded like a drum. The werewolf snarled, and its eyes narrowed. It sensed the ranger was about to attack. With a blur of speed, the beast crossed the distance to its prey in a split second. It pounced, and Karlach hardly had the chance to scream. With lightning speed, the monster was upon him. Woven shot his arrow, but this time the point only grazed the wolf's flank, bouncing harmlessly off the beast's thick hide. Swearing, Woven drew his silver sword and raced towards the downed figure of his comrade, who was desperately struggling to hold the monster's fangs away from his face. He winced as he heard Karlach's arm snap as the wolf's jaws clamped around it. He felt pride, however, that the younger man did not scream out the pain he must surely be feeling. To do so would alert the army still marching through the valley below. Blood sprayed as a talon raked at Karlach's chest. Woven reached the struggling pair, and without hesitation raised his sword high into the air. With a two-handed downward thrust, he stabbed the werewolf between its shoulders. The tip of the blade ripped through flesh and bone until it burst the monster's heart, ripped through its chest, and stopped just inches from Karlach's face. Before the wolf could roar out its pain and give away their position, Woven drew a dagger from his cloak and deftly sliced the snarling monster's throat, cutting off the gurgling scream of pain. With a kick, he rolled the heavy corpse off his companion, only to find Karlach covered in blood and gasping for air. His chest was a mass of cuts where the talons had scratched at it, and his arm was at an impossible angle. It was then he saw the bite mark on the younger man's neck, and despair filled him. Woven slumped to his knees. The bite of a werewolf meant one thing to anyone who was not eaten or killed outright. The werewolf's saliva spread into open wounds, passing the cursed magic onto the victim. Karlach would turn into the very thing the rangers hunted, a monster of evil. Karlach grabbed Woven's shoulder and drew him close. His breathing was rapid with fear. "Woven," he tried to say. He coughed, causing blood to foam at his mouth. "Already, I can feel it," he managed to utter. His eyes turned glassy, and their colour began to change, first to black, and then slowly to yellow. Woven picked up his sword and put the blade to Karlach's neck. "I'm sorry, my friend. It is better to die a man and under the grace of Neverin than a monster of the darkness," he said reverently.
reciting the ranger's code. With a thrust of his blade, Karluk was silenced, never to rise again. Woven fell to his knees and sobbed. All the while the army below continued its march. It seemed as though the horde would never end. He respectfully said a silent prayer to Neverin for his friend's soul and knelt to retrieve the pendant around his neck. The young man's fiancée would despair at the news. With a final glance at the scene below, Woven turned away and began to move down the mountainside. He had to warn the soldiers at Fuwayo Pass.
Chapter 8. The barricade had taken 3 days of constant building to finally be constructed. It was an engineering feat worthy of the ancient Golden Empire. The manpower needed to erect the massive mounds of earth in order to block a pass over a mile wide was immense. 20,000 soldiers of the barony of Eclin had been put to the task, and none had protested. They had each heard the rumours of the nightmare that was threatening to overwhelm their homeland, and they were itching for the chance to deal out death to their foes. Baron Lido watched as the final wooden stake was hammered into place, finishing the last line of defences. 100 paces in front of the stakes were the hastily built watchtowers and palisades. Archers would take a position in the towers, whilst the infantry would hold the walls. In front of that was the great mound of earth that was so steep it took a man several attempts to reach the top. There the skirmishers would be placed. Among them, the rangers and hunters, experts at hit and fade tactics. The Baron hoped that they would deliver such a hail of arrows that any enemy would turn tail and flee, even one that was said to have magic as its ally. Finally, there was the field of stakes that would slow down any attackers and would buy his forces time to regroup and counterattack if the battle began to go ill. Interspersed between the stakes were pits filled with sharpened sticks and nails. At a signal, the pit could be collapsed by one of the many squires that would be waiting behind the battle line. The Baron had made it clear to the young boys that they would have an important role to perform. They would be the ones who would resupply the arrows and weapons of the troops and bring food and water. Lido was a confident commander. He had ruled the mountain lands for 30 years. He had seen his fair share of battles, both against mortal enemies and the remnants of the dark mages that sometimes attacked. Zombies and ghouls were of no concern to him. He had seen and fought them before, and he had emerged victorious. This time, however, something made him doubt. A nagging feeling that this time he would face something far more terrible than the centuries-old leftovers of the magic wars. The war raging for the crown in the southern lands was of little concern to Lido. His name was listed as one of the so-called 6 claimants, but in reality he and his men had not even marched against the other claimants. His war was here, like it had always been. His task was to defend Delfinnia from what lay within and beyond the vast Eclin mountain range. A zombie was a feeble thing, slow and weak. The ghouls, however, never lost their power and were formidable foes. He adjusted his sword belt and gripped the hilt of his sword tighter. It was named the Mountain's Hammer, and it had once belonged to his ancestor who had fought in that terrible final battle of the magic wars. The hilt was ornately decorated with golden serpents, and at the centre was laid a blue channeling crystal, which enabled the magic inside to enchant the blade. The mages toppled mountains in their battles. Rivers turned to blood, and men died by the thousands. Only Neverin had saved them that day, his grandfather had said, but it was never a victory. Those words now came to haunt Lido. What had the old man meant by that? All of the historians claimed it had been a total victory. The Knights of Neverin had slain the necromancer, and the Dire Sect had successfully defeated Danon, the master of black magic. A champion had slain the evil mage, and white mages had sent his soul into the void of damnation. Lido began to doubt the old tales. With an enemy that was sounding more and more like the great enemy of old, he began to think the old man was onto something. It was at dawn the next day that the ground began to shake and tremble. Men groggily stirred from their tents, wrapped in thick furs against the frigid cold, to see what was happening. The alarm bells began to toll out over the vast camp. The enemy had arrived. Running at the point of exhaustion, Woven reached the barricade just ahead of the coming horde.
"Halt! Who goes there?"
challenged the knight defending the mound.
"My name is Woven," he replied tiredly. "I must speak to the Baron at once."
He showed the knight his blue crystal pendant, the identifying mark of the Rangers,
and was promptly allowed entry. He made his way through a camp in chaos as thousands of soldiers armed themselves and moved to their positions. The squires ran about stamping out the cooking fires before heading to their posts. Horses were saddled as the knights pulled on their armour and fastened their sword belts. A horn's low warning tone echoed over the camp, causing the activity to pause for a moment. Woven stopped and listened, just like all of the others around him. Carried faintly on the wind came the sound of inhuman moans, the snarling of beasts and the steady stomping of thousands of armoured troops. The forces of Eclin were afraid. Woven could see it in the eyes of his countrymen, and he had said a silent prayer. He prayed his people would win the day.
"Why are you bastards just standing around?"
roared a squat man in plate armour.
"Pull your fingers out of your asses and get ready to kill!"
He was short, but his chest was massive. It exuded physical strength. The troops all turned to the man, questioning looks on their faces.
"You're all afraid? You're the sons of Eclin, the wolves of the mountain! Let our forces hear us roar! Let them come and die! Roar with me!"
With that, the man bellowed his anger and defiance. Men around him joined him, and before long, 20,000 soldiers were roaring along with him. The sound was like thunder blasting through the canyon and the mountain peaks. Woven glanced around him. It seemed his prayer had been answered for now. With that one act, all the men of Eclin now looked determined and fearless. He just hoped their newfound courage would last. Once more the camp burst into activity as troops assembled and archers mounted the towers and palisades. Woven turned as the sound of galloping hooves caught his attention. None other than Baron Lido was approaching, riding a black stallion. The Baron's shoulder-length grey hair and piercing green eyes were covered by a coif of chainmail. As the horse passed through the camp, the men bowed their heads or knelt in respect and fealty. The Baron stopped in front of the squat man.
"Hail, Sir Grandir. I see your way with words has not lessened since we last met,"
Lido greeted dryly.
Grandir bowed his head. "Nyvirin will always be there to give courage to those who are lacking, my lord," Grandir replied icily. "Eclin has always been a stalwart and worthy member of the realm. It is an honour for me and my company to fight beside you, my lord."
The Baron huffed and rode on to Woven. His face betrayed his annoyance at having the knights of Nyvirin at his side. Lido, among many nobles and regents, felt that the knights had outstayed their welcome and had become too powerful. Eclin especially resented the order due to the knights' persecution of those who followed the old ways. Long before the Magic War and the founding of Delfinnia, the Golden Empire had ruled the land. They had worshipped forgotten gods and practiced insane magical arts. Eclin was said to be the land where Danon and his bride, the first witch Clyria, discovered their power, and it was for this reason that the knights regularly sent crusades to the barony to root out any users of the old ways. The barbaric mountain tribes had always raided Eclin, so the kings of Delfinnia had allowed the knights to wage their wars. Lido resented having to allow them access to his men and resources, but he disliked Sir Grandir especially. He was the head of the Eclin chapter of the order, and was constantly undermining the Baron's commands, often overruling him with the law of Nyvirin. Lido knew the knights were fearsome warriors, and knew any Baron would want them to fight at his side, but the knight was infuriating to deal with.
"The guards informed me of your return, Ranger," Lido said to Woven. "What news do you bring me? And where is your comrade?"
Woven took a deep breath and recounted all he had seen, the death of Carlock and the horde of undead. The Baron stared at the Ranger, his eyes hard.
"Werewolves? Zombies? These are the aspects of the old enemy, are they not?
How was this possible?" Fear gripped the Baron's heart. He had hoped and prayed that the stories were just fantasy. The stories his father had told him flooded his mind. How could he face such a foe by himself? Eclin could not hope to stand against such evil alone.
"Danon is dead,"
Grandir said certainly. He approached the Baron and Woven after hearing the conversation.
"The bastard's body was thrown into the void. No, this new threat must be the result of meddlers in the dark arts. For too long, I've tried to get my master to launch a full crusade against these mountains, but he felt the threat from magic had left us. Danon has not returned. It's impossible," he declared, albeit with some doubt in his words.
The Baron scowled at the knight, but seemed to relax at the words spoken.
"You are correct, of course, Sir Grandir. Danon is gone forever. When this is over, I will allow full access to my lands for you to launch your crusade. Never again must these relics from the Magic War threaten the realm. We must root them out and burn them."
Just as Grandir was about to reply, the horns sounded again. This time the enemy was in range of the first line of defences.
The Battle of Fuayo Pass was about to begin. The pass was a mile across, with steep mountains on either side. It was a perfect spot to mount a defence, and the forces of Eclin were confident of victory. The horde of the enemy stood 500 paces from the vast pile of earth that formed the first line of defences. Thousands of black-armoured figures stood in eerie silence, their faces concealed by their helmets. Behind them staggered the zombies, moans filling the cold air, chilling the defenders' blood with fear. At the flanks came the werewolves, in numbers not seen for eons. They roared and snarled at the rangers who took position on the top of the earth mound. Woven was among them. Being one of the most skilled archers in the kingdom, he insisted on joining his fellow rangers. He was still weary from his journey to the camp, but fear and adrenaline kept his mind sharp and gave his arms the strength needed to draw his massive longbow. 6,000 rangers stood with their bows drawn, arrows of death notched and ready to fly at the enemy. Tension filled the air. Men sweated and prayed. And then came the roar. The black-armoured troops surged forward, swords and spears at the ready, charging headlong into the Eclin defenders. Within moments they came into range of the rangers, who, as one, loosened the first volley of arrows. The sky turned dark as thousands of arrows momentarily blocked out the sun and slammed into the attacking forces with a deafening crash. Woven stood, stunned as he watched the arrows strike. Hundreds of the armoured figures had been struck, and yet none fell, or even screamed out in either terror or jubilation at having survived. It was then, as the horde continued to come at him, that he realized with horror that he had been mistaken. The armoured figures were not men, or even mortal. They were ghouls. Another volley of arrows was loosed, and another, and still not a single figure fell. The rangers began to desperately shoot shaft after shaft, but still none fell. Panic swept through their ranks as they realized that they could not harm the enemy. It was then, just after the first defenders were about to break, that Woven saw the werewolves charging along the flanks. Those he knew they could kill. "Target the flanks! Kill the wolves!" he bellowed. Putting his words into action, he swung his bow to the right and loosed. The arrow pierced his target in the eye. With a satisfying roar of pain, the beast collapsed into the ground. Now all the other archers loosed their arrows at the werewolves, killing dozens at a time, but still the armoured figures inexorably approached the rangers. Soon they would reach the foot of the earthworks, and the sword work would begin. The armoured figures reached the mound and halted. The werewolves fell back, having learnt not to approach the stinging arrows. Once again, an eerie silence filled the pass. Woven stopped shooting and shifted nervously. He could see that the rangers had slain at least 50 wolves, but they hadn't even inflicted a scratch on the armoured enemy that now stood in ominous silence. "Draw swords!" Woven growled. With the wolves out of range, their arrows were harmless against the armoured ghouls. He wasn't even sure if the sword would harm them. He just knew they had to try. The ghouls stamped their feet, causing the ground to shake. Incessantly they carried on stamping, unnerving the defenders. Then came the zombies. Thousands of them swarmed through the ranks of ghouls and scrabbled up the earthworks. Some were headless, others had limbs missing, but all had once been villagers. A father, a husband, a wife, or a sister. All had once been mortal human beings. Many fell backwards down the steep mound, but as soon as they fell, they would right themselves and try again. Hundreds managed the climb and immediately attacked the rangers, who now stabbed and fought desperately. Woven saw that the horde was swarming all along the earthwork. When one zombie was finally slain, 2 more would take its place. The foot of the earthworks was soon filled with their corpses, over which more zombies climbed to get up the steep bank. Woven decapitated a zombie and impaled another on his blade. They were easy to destroy, but the sheer number was starting to cause the defence line to collapse. Hundreds of rangers were now falling under the swarm of undead, their screams muffled by moans and the sound of battle. Blood sprayed Woven's face as a zombie sunk his teeth into the neck of a nearby ranger. "Fall back!" roared the now familiar voice of Sir Grandir. Charging fast from the direction of the second defence line came the Knights of Navarran. There were only 40 of them, but their warhorses smashed into the zombies that had successfully scaled the earthworks. Now Woven and the surviving rangers turned and jumped, scrambling down the steep banks towards the second line. Once more, the roar of the werewolves filled his ears. Now that the archers had been driven off, the beasts attacked en masse. Hundreds of fleeing rangers were chased down and torn apart by the monsters. Woven didn't look back as he ran past the charging knights. The mounted warriors hacked their way through the zombies, rescuing wounded rangers. A werewolf leapt, sending a knight sprawling to the ground. His horse whinnied in fear and was abruptly silenced as the wolf sunk its teeth into the poor creature's neck. Zombies overwhelmed one knight, throwing him to the ground before ripping away his armour and ripping into his flesh. Woven wished he could block out the screams. Never before had he witnessed such horror in battle. Yet more horror was still to come. Stood behind the ranks of the undead was a tall figure. Its flesh was rotted, and its bones were visible. At first glance, it looked like a walking skeleton. In fact, it was a lich. A tattered and torn cloak billowed in the cold breeze sweeping through the pass. In the lich's hands was a long black staff, which it now held high in the air. With an unearthly scream, the ghouls advanced upon the Eclin defenders. Victory for the undead quickly followed.